Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is open his heart when he's spent years building walls around it. That's exactly what happened when a lone mountain man found a pregnant widow left to die in the frozen streets, with nobody to protect her and nowhere to turn. He'd lived alone in those mountains for years, keeping to himself, asking nothing from the world. But when he saw her there, beaten, abandoned, carrying a child, something inside him changed. He made her a promise that day, one that would cost him everything he thought he wanted. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to trust offers his whole life to save two souls he barely knows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing that February morning, cutting through the streets of Pine Ridge with teeth made of ice. Nathaniel Cordell felt it against his weathered face as he guided his pack mule through the muddy ruts that passed for the town's main street. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a beard that had gone more grey than brown in the 7 years since he'd retreated to his cabin in the high country. His eyes were the colour of winter sky, pale blue and distant, set deep beneath heavy brows that gave him a perpetual look of careful consideration. He didn't come to town often, once a month, maybe, when supplies ran low or when the pelts he'd trapped needed trading. The routine never varied much. He'd tie up outside Garrison's general store, exchange his furs for credit, load up on flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and whatever else couldn't be hunted or made by hand. Then he'd disappear back into the mountains before anyone could engage him in more than the briefest conversation. The people of Pine Ridge had learned to leave Nathaniel Cordell alone. They called him the Ghost when they spoke of him at all, which wasn't often. Some of the older folks remembered when he'd first arrived in the territory, just after the war ended. He'd had a young wife then, pretty thing named Emma, and they'd taken up a small homestead at the base of the mountains. They'd seemed happy enough, the kind of couple that made other folks believe in fresh starts and new beginnings. Then the fever came through in the winter of '68. It took Emma and their infant son within 3 days of each other. The boy had been barely 6 months old, hadn't even had time to develop his father's eyes or his mother's smile. Folks said Nate buried them on a hillside overlooking their cabin, marked the graves with stones he'd carried up from the creek bed. After that, he sold the homestead, packed what little he owned, and vanished into the high country. That had been 7 years ago. The war had made him hard. Losing his family had made him empty. That's what Doc Henderson said anyway, and Doc had known Nate longer than most. They'd served together, seen things in places like Shiloh and Antietam that no man should have to carry in his memory. Doc had come west to forget, taken up healing instead of killing. Nate had come west to disappear entirely. On this particular morning, Nate had more on his mind than usual. The winter had been brutal, even by mountain standards. Game was scarce, and he'd had to range farther than normal to check his trap lines. His supplies had run lower than he liked, which meant this trip to town couldn't be postponed any longer, weather be damned. Pine Ridge hadn't changed much in the month since his last visit. Same false-fronted buildings leaning slightly in the wind. Same handful of horses tied outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon, even at this early hour. Same sense that the town existed in a kind of permanent state of waiting, though what it was waiting for, nobody could say. Nate pulled his mule to a stop outside Garrison's store and looped the reins around the hitching post. The animal huffed and stamped, as uncomfortable with town as its owner. Nate pulled his coat tighter against the wind and was about to step onto the boardwalk when he heard raised voices from the alley that ran between the general store and the livery stable. He paused. Town business was town business, and he'd learned long ago not to involve himself in the petty disputes that seemed to occupy frontier life. But something about these voices made him hesitate. One was a man's voice, rough and mean. The other was quieter, pleading. "You had your chance, lady," the rough voice said. "Mr. Reese gave you more than enough time to be reasonable. Please, the other voice answered, barely more than a whisper. "I told you I won't sign. That land was my husband's. It's all I have left of him." Nate's jaw tightened. He knew he should walk into the store, conduct his business and leave. Whatever was happening in that alley wasn't his concern. He'd spent 7 years perfecting the art of not caring about other people's problems, but his feet carried him toward the alley anyway. What he saw there made something cold and hard settle in his chest. A woman was backed against the wall, one arm wrapped protectively around her middle. Even through her heavy coat, Nate could see she was pregnant, maybe 6 or 7 months along. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, blood crusting at the corner of her mouth. 2 men stood in front of her, ranch hands by the look of them, one still holding her by the arm. The taller of the 2 men was just drawing his hand back to strike her again when he noticed Nate standing at the mouth of the alley. He froze, his expression shifting from cruel pleasure to cautious evaluation. "This ain't your concern, mister," the man said. Nate didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his pale eyes moving from the men to the woman and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Let her go." The shorter man laughed, though it sounded nervous. "You know who we work for? Dalton Reese. Don't take kindly to folks interfering in his business." "Don't know him," Nate said. "Don't care. Let her go." The tall man's face darkened. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip. He never reached it. Nate crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, caught the man's wrist in a grip that made bones creak, and twisted. The man went down on his knees with a grunt of pain. The shorter man fumbled for his own weapon, but Nate was faster. He drew the Colt from his belt and laid the barrel alongside the man's temple with just enough force to send him sprawling into the mud. The tall man tried to rise, but Nate put a boot on his chest and pressed him back down. "You boys are going to walk away now," Nate said. "And you're going to tell your Mr. Reese that this woman isn't his business anymore. You understand?" The man glared up at him, but nodded. Nate stepped back and let him up. The 2 ranch hands gathered themselves and stumbled out of the alley, casting dark looks back over their shoulders. When they were gone, Nate turned to the woman. She was sliding down the wall, her legs no longer able to support her. He caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. She was clutching something against her chest, and when he looked closer, he saw it was a worn leather Bible, the cover cracked and stained. Her eyes fluttered open, dark brown and filled with pain. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them take my baby." Then her eyes closed, and she went limp in his arms. Nate stood there in that frozen alley, holding a stranger who'd just become his responsibility, and felt the careful walls he'd built around his life begin to crack. Nate carried the unconscious woman through the back streets of Pine Ridge, taking care to avoid the main thoroughfare where curious eyes might see and gossip might spread. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and that worried him more than the bruises on her face. A woman this far along in her pregnancy should have more substance to her, should have the healthy fullness that came with carrying a child. Instead, she felt like a collection of bones wrapped in worn fabric and desperation. Doc Henderson's office sat at the far end of town, a small clapboard building with a hand-painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. Nate kicked at the door with his boot, unable to knock properly with his arms full. After a moment, he heard footsteps inside, and the door swung open to reveal a stocky man with steel-grey hair and spectacles perched on his nose. "Nathaniel," Doc said. Then his eyes dropped to the woman in Nate's arms and his expression changed. "Bring her in, quickly." The examination room smelled of carbolic acid and old leather. Doc cleared the table with one sweep of his arm, sending papers and instruments clattering to the floor. Nate laid the woman down as gently as he could, then stepped back to let Doc work. "What happened?" Doc asked, already checking her pulse, examining the bruises on her face. "Found her in the alley behind Garrison's," Nate said. 2 of Dalton Reese's men were working her over. Doc's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Sarah Mitchell," he said quietly. "I was wondering when she'd turn up, or if she would at all. You know her?" "Know of her," Doc said, cleaning the blood from her face with gentle efficiency. "Her husband was Thomas Mitchell, had a small ranch about 10 miles east of here. Good man. School teacher before he took up ranching. He was murdered 3 weeks ago." Nate felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Murdered?" Doc nodded, his hands never stopping their work. "Shot in his own barn. Sheriff says it was drifters, but everyone knows it was Reese's doing. Thomas wouldn't sell his land, you see. Had water rights that Reese wanted, so Reese made sure he got them anyway. And the wife? Disappeared the same night. Most folks figured she ran off, maybe went back east to family. Some thought Reese's men killed her too and just hid the body better." Doc paused, his fingers gentle on Sarah's swollen belly. "But here she is, pregnant and half-starved by the look of her." Nate watched as Doc continued his examination. The woman, Sarah, stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her hand moved to her belly in an instinctive, protective gesture, even in unconsciousness. "How bad is it?" Nate asked. Doc was quiet for a long moment. "The baby seems all right, strong heartbeat. But she's malnourished, dehydrated, and these bruises." He shook his head. "This wasn't the first beating. There's older damage here, ribs that didn't heal quite right, bruises on top of bruises. She's been running for weeks, I'd guess, hiding, not eating enough, not sleeping enough. Will she live?" Doc looked at him over his spectacles. "That depends on what happens next. Her body's at the end of its reserves, Nathaniel. She needs rest, good food, warmth, and safety. She needs someone to take care of her until that baby comes, and probably for a good while after." He paused. "She needs things this town can't give her. Not with Reese still walking around free." Nate understood what Doc wasn't saying. "The sheriff won't help. Sheriff Tompkins is on Reese's payroll, same as half the county." Doc's voice was bitter. "Even if he wasn't, Reese has 20 men working for him. The law doesn't reach very far out here when money and guns are involved." Sarah's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, confused, darting around the unfamiliar room. Then they landed on Nate, and something like recognition flickered there, though they'd never met before today. "You," she whispered, "in the alley. You stopped them." Nate nodded, unsure what to say. Sarah tried to sit up, and Doc put a restraining hand on her shoulder. "Easy now, Mrs. Mitchell. You're safe here." "No," she said, and there was an edge of panic in her voice. "No, I'm not safe anywhere. They'll come back. They always come back." Her hand clutched at the leather Bible that still lay beside her on the table. "They want me to sign the deed. They want Thomas's land. And when I wouldn't," her voice broke, "they killed him, right in front of me. They made me watch. We took so, we too we've some, we've not." Doc's face went pale. "You were there? You saw it happen?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her bruised face. "Thomas told me to run. While they were. She couldn't finish. I hid in the root cellar. Heard them searching the house, looking for me. I waited until they left, then I took what I could carry and ran. I thought if I could get to town, if I could find the sheriff." "The sheriff's in Reese's pocket," Doc said gently. "I know that now," Sarah said. "He sent me back to them, told me to stop causing trouble, to sign the papers and move on with my life." She laughed, a broken sound. "So Reese's men brought me to the alley. Said they'd beat the signature out of me if they had to. Said if I died, well, that would solve the problem just as well." Nate had been listening in silence, but now he spoke. "The baby. Thomas's child." Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Due in about 2 months." Thomas was so excited. He'd already started building a cradle, planning for the future. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He never got to finish it." The room fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. Nate could feel Doc watching him, could feel the weight of the decision that was forming even before he'd fully acknowledged it. "She can't stay here," Doc said finally. "Soon as Reese's men report back that someone interfered, he'll come looking. And when he finds out she's alive and talking, I'll take her," Nate said. Both Doc and Sarah stared at him. "What?" Doc said. "To my cabin, in the mountains. No one knows where it is except you. She'll be safe there." "Nathaniel," Doc said carefully, "you don't know what you're offering. She needs constant care. The baby could come early after what she's been through. And Reese, if he finds out you're harboring her—" "He won't find out," Nate said. His voice was calm, certain. "Haven't had a visitor yet that I didn't invite." Sarah was shaking her head. "I can't ask you to do that. You don't even know me. I can't put you in danger." "You're not asking," Nate said, meeting her eyes. "I'm offering. Those men were going to kill you, kill your baby. I can't." He stopped, surprised by the emotion that had crept into his voice. "I won't let that happen." Sarah searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because after a moment she nodded. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" Nate was quiet for a long moment. "Because 7 years ago I couldn't save my own wife and son. Maybe I can save you and yours." Doc pulled something from Sarah's coat pocket, a silver locket on a delicate chain. He opened it, revealing a small photograph inside. A young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile looked back at them. "Thomas?" Doc asked. Sarah nodded, taking the locket with trembling fingers. "It's all I have left of him." Doc turned to Nate. "You'll need supplies, food, medical materials, blankets. I'll put together what I can. But Nathaniel, once you do this, there's no going back. Reese will know someone helped her. He'll be looking." "Let him look," Nate said. "He won't find what he's looking for." An hour later, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Nate guided his mule out of Pine Ridge, with Sarah wrapped in blankets and secured in front of him on his horse. She was still weak, still hurting, but her eyes were clearer now. Doc had given her something for the pain and made Nate promise to bring her back if any complications arose. As they left the town behind and headed into the wilderness, Sarah spoke quietly. "Thank you. For my life. For my baby's life." Nate didn't answer right away. He was watching the trail ahead, reading the land the way a sailor reads the sea, looking for the safest path home. Finally he said, "Don't thank me yet. Winter in the mountains isn't easy, and we've got a long road ahead before that baby comes." "I'm not afraid," Sarah said. "Not anymore." Nate felt her weight against him, felt the trust implicit in the way she let herself lean on his strength. Something in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 7 years, cracked just slightly. "Good," he said. "Fear doesn't help anyone survive." They rode into the mountains as the first stars appeared overhead, leaving behind the town and its dangers. Neither of them knew that their troubles were just beginning, or that the simple act of mercy Nate had shown in that alley would change both their lives forever. 6 weeks passed, and the mountain winter deepened its grip on the land. Snow fell in heavy blankets, transforming the world into something pristine and unforgiving. The cabin became an island in a white sea, connected to the wider world only by the trails Nate maintained through sheer force of will and daily effort. Sarah's pregnancy advanced into its 8th month. Her belly had grown round and full, and she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. Doc Henderson had warned that the baby could come early after all the trauma Sarah had endured, so every day that passed without incident felt like a gift. Down in Pine Ridge, events were unfolding that neither Nate nor Sarah knew about yet. Dalton Reese had consolidated his power over the winter, using the isolation of the season to pressure other small ranchers. 2 more families had sold out to him, taking far less than their land was worth, rather than face the alternative. The sheriff looked the other way, as he always did when Reese's money was involved. But Reese hadn't forgotten about Sarah Mitchell. Her disappearance gnawed at him. He'd sent men to search the abandoned Mitchell ranch, thinking she might have returned there. They'd found nothing. He'd posted watchers at the few roads leading out of the territory, thinking she'd fled east. No one had seen her. It was as if she'd vanished into the mountains themselves, which, in a way, she had. For Rhys, it was more than just the land now. It was about control, about the message that would be sent if a pregnant widow could defy him and disappear. He'd put word out that he'd pay good money for information about Sarah Mitchell. So far, no one had collected. But winter wouldn't last forever. When spring came and the passes opened, people would talk. Someone would remember something. Dalton Rhys was a patient man when he needed to be. Back at the cabin, Sarah and Nate had settled into a deeper rhythm. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a comfortable partnership. They moved around each other with practiced ease now, understanding each other's routines, respecting each other's spaces. One evening, after a simple dinner of venison stew, Sarah brought up something that had been on her mind for days. "Nate," she said, setting down her spoon, "I need to ask you something." He looked up from his plate, waiting. "What happens when the baby comes?" "After." She placed her hand on her belly. "I can't stay here forever. You didn't sign up to be a permanent caretaker, and I can't go back to Pine Ridge. Rhys will be waiting." Nate was quiet for a long time. He'd been thinking about this question himself, turning it over in the quiet hours when he should have been sleeping. "Don't know yet," he finally said, "but we've got time to figure it out." "Do we?" Sarah asked. "Spring will come, the passes will open, and then what? Do I just stay hidden forever? Raise my daughter in isolation because it's not safe anywhere else?" "There are other towns," Nate said, "other territories, places where Rhys's reach doesn't extend." "But I'd be alone," Sarah said. "A widow with a baby and no way to support myself. Do you know what happens to women like that on the frontier? The choices they have to make?" Nate did know. He'd seen it often enough during his years before the mountains. Women without men to protect them, without resources, forced into situations no one should have to endure. The thought of Sarah facing that future made something dark and protective rise in his chest. "You won't be alone," he heard himself say. Sarah looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" Nate set down his own spoon, choosing his words with care. "I made you a promise in that alley. Said I'd protect you and your baby. That promise doesn't have an expiration date just because the immediate danger passes. You can't watch over us forever," Sarah said gently. "That's not fair to you. You came to these mountains to be alone, and I've already disrupted that for months. I won't let you sacrifice more than you already have." "What if it's not a sacrifice?" Nate asked. The question hung in the air between them. Sarah searched his face, trying to understand what he was offering, what he meant. "When I first came here," Nate continued, his voice low and thoughtful, "I thought being alone was what I needed. Thought if I cut myself off from everything, I could somehow cut off the pain too. But pain doesn't work that way. It just sits there, waiting, growing." He looked at her directly. "These past weeks, having you here, it's been strange, uncomfortable sometimes. But it's also been—" He struggled for the word. "It's been alive. This cabin's been alive in a way it hasn't been in 7 years. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "Nate, I'm not saying I know what the future looks like," he said quickly. "I'm not making promises I can't keep. But I am saying you don't have to face it alone. However it looks, whatever it takes, you and that baby will be protected. That's not negotiable." Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. This time, Nate didn't pull away. "You're a good man, Nathaniel Cordell, better than you give yourself credit for." "I'm a man trying to do right," Nate said. "That's all I can be." They sat like that for a moment, hands touching, an understanding passing between them that went beyond words. Then Nate gently withdrew his hand and stood up. "I've been working on something. Want to show you." He went to the corner of the cabin where he'd been storing his project, covered with a canvas tarp. With careful movements, he pulled the tarp away. A cradle stood there, beautiful in its simplicity. Made from pine, the wood was sanded smooth and fitted together with perfect joints. The sides were carved with delicate patterns, pine trees and mountains, stars and moons. It rocked gently when touched, balanced perfectly on its curved base. Sarah stood up slowly, one hand on her belly, and walked over to it. She ran her fingers over the carved designs, feeling the hours of work, the care in every detail. "You made this? For the baby?" "Figured she'd need somewhere to sleep," Nate said, suddenly self-conscious. "Not much good at fancy work, but it's solid. Safe. That's what matters." "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "Nate, it's perfect." She turned to look at him, and Nate saw tears streaming down her face. Before he could react, she'd crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around him. Her pregnant belly pressed between them, her face against his chest. Nate stood frozen for a moment, arms at his sides, unprepared for the contact. Then, slowly, carefully, he brought his arms up and returned the embrace. It was awkward, tentative, the hug of a man who'd forgotten how to offer comfort. But it was real. "Thank you," Sarah said against his chest. "Thank you for everything. For my life, for my baby's life, for making us feel," her voice caught, "for making us feel like we matter." "You do matter," Nate said. The words rough but sincere. "Both of you." They stood like that for a long moment, two broken people holding each other up, finding strength in shared loss and unexpected connection. Outside, wind howled through the pines and snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something warm and fragile was taking root. When they finally separated, both were self-conscious, aware they'd crossed another invisible line. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled. "Thomas would have liked you. He always respected men who kept their word." "I would have liked him too," Nate said. "Any man who could make you smile the way you do when you read his journal, that's a man worth knowing." Sarah touched the locket at her throat. "I wish you could have met him. Wish he could see what you've done for us." "Maybe he can," Nate said. "My Emma, I used to think I felt her sometimes. In the wind, in the quiet. Maybe the people we lose don't go as far as we think." "I hope you're right," Sarah said. "I hope he knows his daughter will be safe. That's all he wanted, all he died trying to ensure." That night, as Sarah settled into sleep behind her partition, she felt the baby moving strongly. Her daughter was active tonight, as if sensing the change in the air, the promise of protection that now surrounded them. And in his place by the fire, Nate sat with his carving knife and a new piece of wood, beginning to shape something small. A toy, perhaps. Or a teething ring. Something a baby might need. He told himself it was just practical. But his hands knew better. They were building a future, one small piece at a time, whether his heart was ready to admit it or not. The next morning brought a visitor. Nate heard the sound first, a horse making its way carefully up the mountain trail. He was outside splitting wood, and the sound made him freeze, axe raised. In 7 years, only one person had ever made the journey to his cabin uninvited. Doc Henderson appeared through the trees, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. The old doctor looked tired, bundled in a heavy coat, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Doc," Nate said, setting down the axe, "what brings you all the way up here?" "Figured I'd better check on our patient," Doc said, dismounting stiffly. "Make sure that baby hasn't decided to come early. And I brought supplies." He patted his saddlebags. "Medicine, some things Sarah might need when her time comes." Nate helped him with the bags, and they went inside, where Sarah was preparing the midday meal. Her face lit up when she saw Doc. Dr. Henderson. What a wonderful surprise. Doc embraced her carefully, then held her at arm's length, examining her with a practiced eye. "You look better, much better. Color in your cheeks, good weight. Mountain living agrees with you." Mountain living and good care, Sarah said, glancing at Nate. Over a meal of beans and cornbread, Doc examined Sarah properly, listening to the baby's heartbeat, checking her overall health. He pronounced both mother and child doing well, though he warned that the baby could come any time now. "I'd say 2 to 3 weeks at most," Doc said. "Could be sooner. You feeling any contractions? Tightening?" "Some," Sarah admitted. "Nothing regular, just practice ones, I think." "Good. That's normal." Doc looked at Nate. "You remember what I taught you? About helping with the birth if I can't get here in time?" Nate nodded, though the thought still made him uncomfortable. Doc had gone over the basics during their last visit to town, but Nate had been hoping, praying that Doc would be able to make it when Sarah's time came. "I'll do my best to be here," Doc said, reading his expression. "But spring weather is unpredictable. Could be clear, could be a blizzard. You need to be prepared." After the examination, Doc pulled Nate aside while Sarah rested. They stood outside the cabin, voices low. "There's something you need to know," Doc said. "Trouble's brewing in town. Dalton Reese is getting anxious. He's been asking questions, pushing people. Seems he's convinced Sarah's still alive somewhere, that someone's hiding her." Nate felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Has he mentioned me?" "Not yet. Most folks don't even know you exist beyond the occasional supply run. But Reese isn't stupid. Eventually, he'll start connecting dots. The same day Sarah disappeared, you were in town. You haven't been back since." Doc paused. "He's offering money now. $500 for information about Sarah Mitchell's whereabouts. That's a lot of money in a poor town. Anyone take the offer?" "Not yet. Folks might not love each other, but they don't love Reese either. They've seen what he does to people who cross him." Doc met Nate's eyes. "But money talks, Nathaniel, especially to desperate men, and spring's coming. When the pass is clear, Reese will have more options for searching." Nate nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, contingencies. 7 years of isolation hadn't erased his military training. He was thinking tactically now, assessing threats, planning defenses. "There's something else," Doc said. "I heard talk, just rumors, mind you, but some say there's more to Thomas Mitchell's murder than just land grabbing. Word is he was mixed up in something bigger. Government business, maybe." "What kind of government business?" "Don't know specifics, but there's been a federal marshal asking questions around town. Man named Garrett. He's been real interested in Thomas Mitchell, what he was working on before he died." Doc shifted his weight. Whatever it was, it might be the real reason Reese wanted him dead. This was new information, and it complicated everything. If Thomas had been involved in federal matters, then Sarah might be in even more danger than they'd thought. "She doesn't know anything about that," Nate said. "Thomas's business, whatever it was." "You sure about that?" Nate thought about the journal Sarah read every morning. Had Thomas recorded anything dangerous in those pages, anything that might explain why powerful men wanted him dead? "I need to talk to her," Nate said. Back inside, after Doc had left with promises to return in a week, Nate sat down with Sarah. She was by the fire, the journal open on her lap as always. "Sarah," Doc told me something about Thomas, that he might have been involved in federal business, government work. Do you know anything about that?" Sarah looked up confused. "Federal business?" Thomas was a school teacher turned rancher. What kind of federal business could he have been involved in? "I don't know, but a marshal's been asking questions in town. And if Thomas was mixed up in something bigger than land disputes, that changes things, changes what we're up against." Sarah looked down at the journal in her hands. "He never mentioned anything like that to me. His writing is all about the ranch, the baby, our future, normal things." She flipped through the pages. Unless what? There are some pages here that seem odd, not his usual writing, more like notes, numbers and names. I always thought it was ranch accounting, but she showed Nate several pages filled with columns of figures, scattered names, dates. Nate studied the pages carefully. They looked like accounting, but there was something strange about them. The names weren't all local. The amounts seemed too large for ranch business. And there were notations in the margins, abbreviations he didn't recognize. Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Think carefully. Did Thomas ever hide anything at your ranch? Papers? Documents? Anything? Sarah thought for a long moment. There was a place, in the barn, a false wall he built. Said it was for valuables, in case of theft. I never thought much about it. Nate's mind was racing. If Thomas had hidden evidence in that barn, and if that evidence was damaging to powerful people, then Sarah wasn't just running from a land-grabbing rancher. She was running from something much more dangerous. We need to figure out what Thomas knew, Nate said. What he was protecting you from, because if there's evidence still at your ranch, then Reese might still be looking for it, Sarah finished, and he won't stop until he finds it, or makes sure no one else can. They sat in silence, the implications settling over them like fresh snow. What had started as a simple act of mercy had become something far more complex. Nate had promised to protect Sarah and her baby. But how do you protect someone when you don't fully understand the threat? Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink, beautiful and cold, like the truth they were beginning to uncover. 3 days later, Nate made the decision to go back to Pine Ridge. They needed answers, needed to understand what they were really dealing with. Sarah had argued against it at first, worried about him being seen, worried about Reese's men. But Nate was careful. He knew how to move unseen when necessary. The war had taught him that. He left before dawn, telling Sarah to bar the door and not open it for anyone but him or Doc Henderson. He'd shown her how to use the rifle, though he prayed she wouldn't need it. The journey down the mountain was treacherous in the dark, but Nate knew every stone and route by heart. He reached Pine Ridge just after sunrise, entering town from the north side, avoiding the main street. He went directly to Doc Henderson's office, slipping in through the back door. Doc was already awake, preparing for the day. His eyes widened when he saw Nate. Thought you'd be staying put until after the baby comes. Need information, Nate said. About Thomas Mitchell. You said there was a federal marshal asking questions. Where can I find him? Doc studied him for a moment, then nodded. He's staying at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, room 3. But Nathaniel, be careful. If Reese's men see you, they won't, Nate said. He made his way through the back alleys to the boarding house, entering through the kitchen where Mrs. Callahan was starting breakfast. She gasped when she saw him, but Nate put a finger to his lips. Need to speak to Marshal Garrett. Quiet-like. Mrs. Callahan, who'd never liked Dalton Reese and his methods, nodded and led him upstairs. She knocked on the door of room 3. Marshal, someone here to see you, says it's important. The door opened to reveal a tall man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. He looked Nate up and down, taking in the mountain man's appearance, the careful way he positioned himself to see both the door and the window. You must be Cordell, the marshal said. I've been hearing about you. We need to talk, Nate said. About Thomas Mitchell. Marshal Garrett stepped aside, letting Nate enter. Once the door was closed, the marshal got straight to the point. Where is she? Sarah Mitchell. Safe, Nate said. That's all you need to know. Is it? Garrett moved to his saddlebag and pulled out a folder of papers. Because what I need, Mr. Cordell, is the only witness who can help me dismantle a criminal organization that's been stealing land from settlers across 3 territories. And that witness is Sarah Mitchell. She doesn't know anything, Nate said. She was just a rancher's wife. Was she? Garrett spread papers across the small table. Thomas Mitchell wasn't just a rancher, Mr. Cordell. He was a government accountant working undercover for the Department of the Interior. We sent him here 2 years ago to investigate widespread land fraud. Nate stared at the papers. Official documents, sealed with government stamps. Thomas Mitchell's real name was Thomas Garrison. He'd been a federal employee assigned to pose as a settler and gather evidence. Thomas discovered something bigger than we expected, Garrett continued. It wasn't just Dalton Reese stealing land. There's a whole network. Corrupt judges, territorial officials, land office clerks. They've been using false surveys, forged deeds, intimidation, and murder to steal prime land from legitimate settlers. Then they resell it to railroad companies and mining operations for massive profits. How much land? Nate asked. Hundreds of thousands of acres, maybe millions. We're still trying to figure out the full scope. Garrett pointed to one of the documents. Thomas compiled evidence for 18 months. Names, dates, forged documents, witness testimony. He was supposed to testify before a federal grand jury last month, but he was murdered first. 3 weeks before his scheduled testimony, we thought the evidence died with him. Garrett looked at Nate directly. But it didn't, did it? He hid it somewhere, and I'm betting Sarah knows where. Nate thought about the journal, the strange notations Sarah had shown him. She might know. She's not sure. I need to talk to her, Garrett said. If we can recover that evidence, we can bring down the entire network. Judge Victor Harland, District Land Commissioner Randolph Pierce, at least a dozen other officials. This is bigger than just Dalton Reese, Mr. Cordell. This is about justice for hundreds of families who've been robbed of their land and their future. And it's about Sarah staying alive long enough to testify, Nate said, because the moment these people know she's around, they'll come after her with everything they have. That's why I'm here. To protect her. Bring her in. Put her in federal custody. No. Nate's voice was flat, final. Your people already failed to protect Thomas. I won't let you fail to protect her. Garrett's jaw tightened. I can't do my job if you obstruct a federal investigation, and I can't protect her if I hand her over to the same system that got her husband killed, Nate shot back. Thomas was working for the government, and they couldn't keep him safe. What makes you think they can protect a pregnant widow? The two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Garrett sighed. What do you propose? Let me talk to Sarah. Find out what she knows. If there's evidence at the Mitchell Ranch, I'll retrieve it. Then we'll figure out the next step together. And if Reese finds her before then, he won't, Nate said with absolute certainty. Garrett studied him for a long moment. You were a soldier, I can tell. Which unit? 3rd Infantry, saw action at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. I was cavalry. 5th New York. We probably passed each other at some point, trying not to die. Garrett extended his hand. All right, Cordell. I'm trusting you, but I need that evidence, and I need it before spring. Once the pass is clear, Harland and his people will move against anyone who might threaten them. That includes Sarah and anyone protecting her. Nate shook the marshal's hand. You'll have your evidence, but Sarah and her baby stay under my protection until this is over. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. But when the time comes for her to testify, when the time comes, we'll talk about it. Not before. Nate left the boarding house the way he'd come, through back alleys and shadows. He was almost to the edge of town when he heard voices, men's voices, rough and familiar. Reese's men, standing outside the general store, offering real money now. $500 for information about that Mitchell woman. Probably froze to death weeks ago. Boss doesn't think so. Thinks someone's hiding her. Been asking about anyone who left town the same day she disappeared. Nate pressed himself against the wall of a building, listening. His name wasn't mentioned, but it was only a matter of time. Reese was getting closer to the truth. They needed to move faster. He made it back to his horse and started the journey home, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. When he arrived at the cabin, he found Sarah sitting at the table with Thomas's journal, but this time she was studying it differently, looking at those strange pages with new eyes. Nate, she said when he entered, I've been looking at these pages again, really looking, And I think these aren't just notes. I think they're a code, a map of some kind. Nate closed the door and moved to the table. He told her everything Marshall Garrett had revealed about Thomas's real identity, his undercover work, the vast criminal conspiracy he'd been investigating. Sarah's face went pale. He was working for the government? All this time he was... She pressed her hand to her mouth. He never told me, never said a word. I thought he was just my husband, just a man trying to build a life. But he was protecting you, Nate said gently. The less you knew, the safer you were, or so he thought. Sarah looked down at the journal with new understanding. These pages, the ones I thought were ranch accounts, they're evidence, aren't they? Part of what Thomas was gathering. Nate examined the pages more carefully now. Numbers that could be land parcels, names that could be corrupt officials, dates that might correspond to fraudulent transactions, and in the margins, in Thomas's careful handwriting, abbreviations and notations that suggested locations. There's more, Sarah said quietly. Evidence he hid. At our ranch, in the barn. The false wall I told you about. He built it not for valuables but for documents. I'm sure of it now. Can you remember exactly where it was? How to access it? Sarah closed her eyes, picturing the barn she'd fled from the night Thomas died. East wall, third board from the floor, seventh from the corner. You push in and slide right. There's a space behind it, about 3 feet deep. Nate committed the details to memory. I'll need to go there, retrieve whatever Thomas hid. It's dangerous, Sarah said. The ranch is probably being watched, and if they catch you, they won't catch me, Nate said. But we're running out of time. Marshall Garrett said once spring comes, Harland and his people will move against anyone who threatens them. We need that evidence before then. Sarah stood up, moving to the window. Outside, snow was falling again, heavy and thick. Thomas died protecting that evidence, protecting me and our baby, and now you're risking your life for the same reason. Not the same reason, Nate said. Thomas was doing his duty to the law. I'm just keeping a promise to protect you and your child. Sarah turned to look at him. Is that all it is? Just a promise? The question hung in the air between them. Nate could have said yes, could have kept the walls up, maintained the careful distance they'd both pretended still existed. But standing there, looking at this woman who'd become so much more than just a responsibility, he found he couldn't lie. No, he said quietly. It's not just a promise anymore. Sarah crossed the room and took his hand. Then come back safe, because this baby needs you. Nate looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. I'll come back. That's a promise I know I can keep. That night, they made plans. Nate would leave in 3 days, giving him time to prepare and scout the approach to the Mitchell Ranch. Sarah would stay at the cabin with the rifle and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone but him or Doc Henderson. And as they sat by the fire, going over every detail, neither mentioned the thing that weighed heaviest on both their minds. Sarah's baby was due any day now. If Nate was gone when her time came, she'd be facing it alone. But some risks had to be taken, some promises had to be kept, no matter the cost. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, hiding their tracks and buying them a little more time. But winter couldn't last forever, and when it ended, the real danger would begin. The next 2 days passed in careful preparation. Nate checked and rechecked his weapons, planned his route to the Mitchell Ranch, thought through every contingency. He'd be traveling at night, moving fast and quiet, using every bit of skill he'd learned in the war. Get in, retrieve the evidence, get out. Simple in theory, dangerous in practice. Sarah watched him prepare with growing anxiety. She helped where she could, preparing food he could carry, checking his supplies. But mostly she tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. On the second night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sarah returned to Thomas's journal. She'd been studying those coded pages obsessively, trying to extract every bit of information that might help Nate succeed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a particular notation in the margin. "This abbreviation, MRBE7. I think that's the location in the barn. Mitchell Ranch, barn, east wall, 7th board. Thomas was telling me where the evidence was, but in a way only I would understand if something happened to him." Nate leaned closer, studying the notation. "Smart man. Made sure you'd have the information even if he couldn't tell you directly." He looked at the other pages. "Are there more codes like this?" Sarah flipped through the journal, pointing out similar abbreviations. "Here, and here. This one says PCCH 1875. I think that's Pierce County Courthouse, 1875. That's where the land office records are kept." "He documented everything," Nate said with grudging admiration. "Built a complete map of the corruption." "That's why they killed him," Sarah said softly. "He knew too much, had too much proof. They couldn't let him testify." Nate was about to respond when Sarah suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Her face went white, then flushed with pain. "Sarah?" Nate was at her side in an instant. "What is it?" "Contraction," she said through gritted teeth. "A real one this time, not practice." She breathed through it, and after a moment the pain eased. "It's all right. First, babies take time. Could still be days away." But Nate saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he felt. The timing was terrible. He was supposed to leave tomorrow night. If Sarah went into labor before he returned, "Maybe I should wait," he said, "until after the baby comes." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We don't have time to wait. Spring's coming early this year. I can feel it. Another week, maybe 2, and the passes will be clear enough for Reese to bring more men up here. We need that evidence now. But if the baby comes, Doc Henderson is only 2 hours away. I'll send word if I need him. I'll be fine, Nate. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." She tried to smile. "Besides, this is a first baby. They always take forever. I'll probably still be in early labor when you get back." Nate wasn't convinced, but he knew she was right about the timing. They were running out of options. "Promise me something," he said. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you send for Doc immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to be brave. Promise me." "I promise," Sarah said. Another contraction came an hour later, then nothing for the rest of the night. False alarm, maybe. Or the baby's way of warning them time was short. The next day passed in a strange, suspended state. Both of them trying to act normal, going through their routines, but the tension was palpable. Sarah had 3 more contractions, spaced hours apart. Still not regular, still not consistent, but getting stronger. That evening, as darkness fell and Nate prepared to leave, he went over everything one more time with Sarah. The rifle was loaded and within easy reach. The door was barred from the inside. Doc Henderson knew to check on her every day. If Nate wasn't back in 4 days, she was to send for Marshal Garrett. 4 days, Sarah said. "You'll be back in 4 days." "Less, if I can manage it," Nate promised. He picked up his pack, then paused. There was something he'd been meaning to say, something he'd been avoiding, because saying it made it real, made it matter. "Sarah, He stopped, struggling for words. "These past weeks, having you here, you've changed things. Changed me. I don't know how to explain it better than that." Sarah stood up, moving close to him. "You don't have to explain it, I know. Because you've changed things for me too. I came here broken, terrified, with nothing but grief and fear. And you gave me hope. Gave me a reason to believe things could be better." Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was the wedding ring he'd worn on a chain around his neck for 7 years. Emma's ring, the last connection to his dead wife. "I want you to hold on to this," he said, placing it in Sarah's hand. "Not forever. Just until I get back. As a promise that I will come back." Sarah looked down at the ring, understanding the weight of what he was giving her. Nate, this was Emma's. I know. And I think she'd understand. I think she'd want you to have it, want someone to be looking after it until I return. He closed Sarah's fingers around the ring. Keep it safe for me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You're coming back. You have to come back. Because she pulled something from around her own neck. Thomas's locket, the one with his picture inside. Because you need to give this to our daughter. Tell her about her father, the man he really was, not just the man I remember. She deserves to know the truth. Nate took the locket, understanding what she was really saying, that he wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was becoming part of her life, part of her daughter's future. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, it felt right. I'll tell her, he promised. I'll make sure she knows what a brave man her father was. Sarah reached up and placed her hand against Nate's bearded cheek. And I'll make sure she knows what a brave man she paused, searching for the right word. What a brave man you are. They stood like that for a moment, close enough to kiss, but not quite crossing that line. There was too much unsaid between them, too much still unresolved. But the connection was there, undeniable, growing stronger every day. Finally, Nate stepped back. I need to go. Make the most of the darkness. Be careful, Sarah said. Come back to us. I will, Nate promised. Then he was gone, slipping out into the night, leaving Sarah alone in the cabin with Emma's ring clutched in her hand and a baby that could come any time. The journey to the Mitchell Ranch took Nate most of the night. He traveled carefully, avoiding any trails where he might be seen, moving through the mountains like the ghost people called him. By dawn, he was in position on a ridge overlooking the ranch. The house and barn stood silent in the grey morning light. From what Nate could see, the place appeared abandoned. No smoke from the chimney, no animals in the corrals, no signs of life. But he waited, watching, using the patience the war had taught him. As the sun rose higher, he spotted them, 2 men, sitting in the shadows of the barn, trying to stay hidden but visible to someone who knew what to look for. Watchers. Reese had posted guards, hoping Sarah might return to her home. Nate smiled grimly. Good. That meant the evidence was still there, still worth protecting. If they'd already found and destroyed it, there'd be no need for guards. He spent the day observing, learning their patterns. The men switched positions every few hours, but they were lazy, undisciplined. They'd been sitting this watch for weeks, probably, growing bored and careless. That would make Nate's job easier. As night fell, Nate moved into position. He waited until the guards were at their most complacent, that dead hour before dawn, when the body wants sleep more than anything. Then he moved. He approached the barn from the blind side, the angle the guards couldn't see from their position. He'd spotted a loose board earlier, and now he pried it open, slowly, quietly, creating just enough gap to slip through. Inside, the barn was dark and smelled of old hay and horses long gone. Nate moved to the east wall, counting boards. 3rd from the floor, 7th from the corner. He found it and pressed in, then slid right, just as Sarah had described. The board moved smoothly, revealing a dark space behind the wall. Nate reached in carefully, his fingers finding something wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out, a leather satchel, surprisingly heavy. He didn't stop to examine it. Outside, he heard one of the guards stirring, walking around to stay awake. Nate had seconds to get out. He clutched the satchel, moved back to the loose board, and slipped through. He was 20 yards from the barn, moving toward the tree line, when he heard a shout behind him. "Hey, someone's there!" Nate ran. Behind him, he heard the guards scrambling, shouting, firing wild shots into the darkness. But Nate was already gone, disappearing into the forest with the evidence that could bring down an entire criminal empire. He ran through the night, pushing hard, knowing they'd be coming after him. Behind him, more shouts, more gunfire. Then horses. They'd sent for reinforcements. Nate used every trick he knew, doubling back on his trail, moving through streams to lose his scent, taking paths no horse could follow. By the time the sun rose, he'd lost them. But he knew they wouldn't give up. They'd keep searching, keep tracking, and they might realize where he was headed, might figure out that the mysterious mountain man who'd helped Sarah was connected to all of this. He needed to get back to the cabin, needed to warn Sarah, needed to get her somewhere safe before Reese's men found them. He pushed harder, running now, racing against time and pursuing enemies. The satchel bounced against his back, heavy with documents that men had killed for, would kill for again. As he climbed into the high country, heading for home, Nate thought about Sarah alone in the cabin, thought about the promise he'd made to return, thought about the baby that could be coming any time. He ran faster. Behind him, far below, Dalton Reese stood in the Mitchell barn, looking at the empty hiding place in the wall. His face was dark with rage. "Find him," he said to the men around him. "Find whoever took those documents. Follow him to hell if you have to. And when you find him," he didn't need to finish. His men knew what he meant. They mounted up and rode out, following the trail of the man who'd stolen their secrets, hunting the ghost in the mountains. The race had begun, and only one side could win. They came at dusk, when the shadows were longest and the light played tricks on the eyes. 6 riders emerged from the tree line, spread out in a loose formation. Dalton Reese rode in the center, flanked by his most trusted men. Behind them, Nate spotted a 7th rider, a man in expensive clothes, who sat his horse like someone used to giving orders, not taking them. "That's Judge Victor Harland," Marshal Garrett said quietly. "He came personally. That's how important those documents are." Nate said nothing, just watched them approach. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, close enough to talk but far enough to be cautious. "Nathaniel Cordell," Reese called out, "I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me." Nate stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games," Reese said. "You took documents from the Mitchell Ranch. Documents that are stolen property. Hand them over, and we'll let you walk away from this." "Funny thing about stolen property," Marshal Garrett said, stepping out beside Nate. "It usually belongs to the thief claiming it's stolen, and I'm a federal marshal investigating land fraud. So those documents aren't going anywhere except to a grand jury." Judge Harland urged his horse forward slightly. "Marshal Garrett, I should have known you'd be involved in this mess. You're out of your jurisdiction and interfering in territorial matters. Stand down before you make things worse for yourself." "My jurisdiction is wherever federal crimes are committed," Garrett replied. "And I've got enough evidence in that cabin to indict you and every man riding with you for conspiracy, fraud, and murder." "Murder," Harland laughed. "Thomas Mitchell was killed by drifters. Everyone knows that." "Thomas Mitchell was a federal agent," Garrett said. "Murdered while performing his duties. That makes it a federal case, and that makes you and Reese accessories to killing a federal officer." The words hung in the air. Several of Reese's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Killing for land was one thing, killing a federal agent was something else entirely. Harland's face darkened. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can," Garrett said. "Because Sarah Mitchell is alive. She witnessed her husband's murder. She's prepared to testify, and with the evidence her husband gathered," he gestured toward the cabin, "I'd say your days of running this territory are over." "Then I guess we'll just have to make sure she never testifies," Reese said, his hand moving toward his gun. What happened next happened fast. Reese drew. Nate fired. Reese's hat flew off his head as the bullet passed within inches of his skull. Every man in the clearing had their weapons out now, but nobody fired. The first shot would start a bloodbath, and nobody was quite ready to cross that line yet. "Next one doesn't miss," Nate said calmly. "Now turn around and ride out." "There's 6 of us and 2 of you," one of Reese's men said. "6 of you out in the open," Nate replied. "2 of us behind cover. I like our odds better." Harlan's face was red with rage. "You're signing your own death warrant, Cordell. Even if you survive today, I'll make sure every lawman in 3 territories is looking for you. You'll hang for this." "Maybe," Nate said, "but you'll be in prison long before that happens." The standoff stretched. Tension built like a storm about to break. Horses stamped nervously, sensing the violence about to erupt. Then, from inside the cabin, came a new sound. A baby crying. The sound seemed to break the spell. Several of Reese's men exchanged glances. One of them, younger than the others, lowered his gun slightly. "Boss," the young one said, "there's a baby in there." "So?" Reese snapped. "So I ain't signed up for killing babies." Another man nodded. "Me neither. Land fraud is one thing. But this, you'll do what I pay you to do," Reese growled. "Not anymore," the young one said. He holstered his gun and backed his horse away. After a moment, 2 others followed him. That left Reese, Harlan, and 2 loyal men. 4 against 2. Still bad odds, but better. Reese's face was twisted with fury. "You want to die protecting a woman who means nothing to you? A baby that's not even yours." "They mean everything to me," Nate said simply. "And I've died before, lost everything that mattered. I won't lose them too." Harlan made his move. He drew a small pistol from his coat, aiming not at Nate, but toward the cabin, toward where the baby's cries were coming from. Nate didn't think. He fired. Harlan fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder, his pistol dropping into the dirt. Then, everything exploded into chaos. Reese and his 2 remaining men charged forward, firing. Nate and Garrett returned fire, using the porch posts for cover. Bullets splintered wood, horses screamed, men shouted. One of Reese's men went down, then the other. But Reese himself kept coming, his face a mask of rage and determination. He made it to the porch, too close for rifles. Nate dropped his gun and drew his hunting knife, the blade his father had carried, his grandfather before that, the blade meant for protecting family. Reese had his own knife out. They came together in a clash of steel and fury, fighting for everything that mattered, winner take all. The fight was brutal and quick. Reese was strong, experienced with a knife, fighting with the fury of a man who'd built an empire through violence and wasn't about to lose it now. But Nate had something Reese didn't. He had a reason to live, people depending on him, a future worth fighting for. When it was over, Reese lay on the porch, disarmed and defeated. Marshal Garrett had Harlan and the wounded men under guard. The 3 who'd ridden away were long gone, probably halfway to the next territory by now. Nate stood over Reese, breathing hard, his father's knife still in his hand. For a moment, he thought about finishing it, about making sure this man could never threaten Sarah or her daughter again. It would be easy, justified, even. Then he heard Sarah's voice from the doorway. "Nate? Is it over?" He turned to see her standing there, pale and exhausted but alive, with the baby wrapped in blankets in her arms. Doc Henderson stood behind her, ready to catch her if she fell. Nate looked at them, this woman who'd become his world, this child who'd become his purpose, and he lowered the knife. "It's over," he said. 3 months later, spring had fully arrived in the mountains. The snow had melted, revealing green meadows and wildflowers. The cabin looked different now, lived in and warm, with laundry hanging on a line outside and the sound of a baby's laughter drifting through open windows. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching as Nate split wood in the clearing. He worked with steady, practiced strokes, his movements efficient and sure. In the 3 months since that terrible night, he'd become a different man. Still quiet, still careful with his words, but no longer carrying the weight of isolation and grief. Behind her, in the cradle Nate had made, baby Grace Emma Cordell slept peacefully. Her name was recorded in the new family Bible that the traveling preacher had given them when he'd married Nate and Sarah 6 weeks ago. A simple ceremony, with Doc Henderson and Marshall Garrett as witnesses, binding together two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage. The marriage had been Sarah's idea, but Nate hadn't needed convincing. The weeks after the confrontation had made one thing clear: they were family now, in every way that mattered. The legal ceremony just made official what their hearts already knew. Marshall Garrett had taken the evidence and arrested everyone involved in the conspiracy. Judge Harland was awaiting trial in federal custody. Dalton Reese and his men were locked up, facing charges of murder, fraud, and attempted murder of a federal officer. The other corrupt officials were being rounded up one by one. The Mitchell Ranch had been returned to Sarah, along with compensation from the territorial government. But Sarah had made a decision that surprised everyone except Nate. She'd sold the ranch, unable to return to the place where Thomas died, and used the money to improve the mountain cabin. They'd added a second room, a proper kitchen, a small barn for animals, turned it from a hermit's hideaway into a real home. The land should go to good people, Sarah had said. People who'll work it honestly, raise families on it. That's what Thomas would have wanted. Some of that money had also gone to establishing a school in Pine Ridge, taught by a young woman from the East. Thomas's dream of education for the territory's children, realized through his widow's generosity and his sacrifice. Now, as Nate finished with the wood and walked over to the porch, Sarah handed him a cup of water. He drank it gratefully, then pulled her close, careful of her still healing body. "Grace is sleeping," Sarah said. "Finally, she fought it for an hour." Nate smiled. "She's stubborn. Gets that from her mother." "And her father," Sarah said. She meant Thomas, but she was also thinking of Nate. Grace would have two fathers in her life, the one who gave her life and the one who saved it. She'd know both their stories, carry both their legacies. "I was thinking," Nate said, "about what you said, about not staying isolated forever, about being part of the world again." Sarah waited, knowing this was hard for him. "Maybe we could go to town more often, let people know us, let Grace grow up knowing there's more than just mountains. I'm not hiding anymore. Don't need to." Sarah reached up and touched his face, feeling the beard he'd trimmed shorter now, seeing the eyes that no longer looked quite so haunted. "We'll take it slow. Whatever you're comfortable with." "I'm comfortable with this," Nate said, gesturing to the cabin, to her, to the life they were building. "With you, with Grace, with all of it. Never thought I'd say that again, but I am." From inside, Grace began to cry, not distressed, just announcing she was awake and wanted attention. Sarah smiled. "That's my cue." She went inside, and Nate followed, watching as she picked up their daughter and held her close. Grace's eyes, dark like her mother's, but with hints of Thomas's gentle expression, looked around the cabin with infant curiosity. Nate approached and held out his finger. Grace grabbed it with her tiny hand, holding tight with the fierce grip of the very young. Something in Nate's chest tightened and loosened at the same time. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "Your Papa Thomas, he loved you very much, gave everything to keep you safe. And your mama here, she's the bravest woman I've ever known. You're named after two women who would have loved you, my Emma, and Thomas's mother, Grace. You've got a lot to live up to." Grace made a small sound, almost like she understood. "But you don't have to do it alone," Nate continued. "You've got your mama, and you've got me. And I promise you," his voice caught slightly, "I promise you'll always be protected, always be loved, always be safe." Sarah leaned against him, and they stood like that for a long moment, a family, cobbled together from loss and trauma and unexpected grace, but a family nonetheless. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The ghost who'd haunted these woods for 7 years had come back to life. The widow who'd fled in terror had found strength and hope, and a baby girl who might have died before drawing her first breath was now gurgling happily, surrounded by love. Some men spend their whole lives running from pain, building walls to keep the world out, choosing isolation over the risk of loss. But the bravest ones stop running. They let themselves heal. They open their hearts when it seems impossible. They take the broken pieces of their lives and build something new. That's what Nathaniel Cordell did, and in saving a widow and her child, he found the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: a reason to live, a reason to love, a reason to believe in tomorrow. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Nate looked at Sarah and Grace, at the home they'd built together, at the future stretching out before them. He'd made a promise in a frozen alley months ago, a promise that had cost him his solitude, his carefully constructed walls, his determined isolation, but it had given him everything that truly mattered. "I'll be husband and father," he'd said. But by choice, not by obligation, but by love. And that made all the difference.